It had been a long, cold February day on a Snodderly farm. The slow, steady rain had swelled the creek, and its current was running strong, making it the perfect day for the locals to pay a visit to Henry Snodderly's mill, to make some flour, and perhaps more importantly, to catch up on all the local gossip. Old man Snodderly himself wasn't one to partake in the ceremonial wagging of tongues due to his reputation as a respectable man of the Lord. After all, had he not donated the land for the local Methodist Episcopal Church, and much of the money to build it for that matter? No, sir. Henry had always remained a bystander during these gossip sessions. After all, in his mind, the reason a man was born with 2 ears and 1 tongue was so he could do twice as much listening as he did talking. Truth be told, Henry Snodderly was the richest man in Union County, Tennessee, and he had operated the mill on Hines Creek for over 70 years. He was still healthy and sharp as a tack at 90 years old. Besides being the community miller, he was also known as a generous man. He had spent several decades of his life donating both time and money to help out those in need. There wasn't a single time anybody in the small town of Maynardville could recall that old man Snodderly had ever turned anyone away. Now, Henry's cabin was located about 100 yards away from the mill, and being the family man that he was, many times he just allowed folks free use of the mill while he stayed at home with his wife Serena, and that way he could spend time with his grandchildren. So, no one thought anything of it when Henry announced that he was heading home for the day, and for his nephew John to oversee the mill. A few moments later, Mr. Snodderly was greeted at the homestead by several family members who had dropped by for supper. And Granny had cooked a fine meal of fried taters, cabbage seasoned with pork, and a cast iron skillet full of hot buttered cornbread. After the meal, the family retired to the main room and took their places, circled around the fireplace. Serena immediately took up her favorite rocking chair and resumed knitting on a piece she'd been working on for the past 3 days. Their daughter Lucinda was also there, and she was a nightly visitor, always helping her mama out around the house. And rounding out the visitors on this night were 2 of the Snodderly's grandchildren, Sam and Rena. Henry never was the type to miss an opportunity to read some scripture to his grandbabies, and what better time to do so than now, as they were all gathered around the cozy fireplace. Outside, a thick fog had settled in, and the rain continued as the darkness began to fall. But inside the cabin, it couldn't have been any more perfect. As the old wise grandsire reached for the good book and began thumbing through his worn-out pages for the perfect passage, he spoke. "Sam, take a look-see out that door and make sure them fellas have finished up at the mill before I start out, 'cause once I get to reading, I don't like to break the moving of the spirit with interruptions." "Yes, sir," the 20-year-old grandson replied cheerfully and walked towards the front door. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment. Sometimes, the most ordinary, routine moments of life can be torn apart in the blink of an eye without any warning. And for this family, that moment had arrived and was waiting for him on the other side of that front door, desperate, cold and wet, with the most evil and wicked intentions ever to reside in a man's soul. Just then, Sam slowly opened the door, careful not to let it swing open too wide and let the cold in. "Yes, sir, Papa. Everything's shut down and all is quiet." Sam moved to close the door when suddenly someone kicked the door open from the other side, sending Sam crashing to the floor. Before anybody could move, there stood a wild-eyed man, soaking wet with rain and pointing a pistol at old man Snodderly. The grandsire gripped his Bible tightly and raised his hands in the air. "Dear Lord, protect us," was all he managed to say before the assassin opened fire, blowing a hole clean through Henry Snodderly's chest as he collapsed to the floor. Chaos broke out in the small cabin, with women and children screaming, when in stepped another masked man with a huge scar running all the way across his forehead. The stranger quickly pointed a pistol at Sam on the floor. Granny was seated right next to the doorway that led to the dining room, and she made a run for it. No sooner than she had stepped through the dining room, another bullet was fired, hitting her in the back. The knitting needles flew from her hands as she crashed through the kitchen table to the floor, still clinging to life desperately as she tried to crawl. Just then, the gunmen followed her. Seeing their opportunity, both Lucinda and Raina ran for the back door. Just as they rounded the corner, bullets rang out again, barely missing them as they disappeared into the dark and rainy night. The gunman returned his attention to Granny, but she had stopped moving as she laid in a pool of blood. There was no one else in the cabin alive except for poor Sam and the two outlaws. "Open the damn dresser and pour everything on the floor," one of the men yelled. Okay, I'll do it. Please don't shoot me," Sam begged as he dumped the contents on the floor. Not seeing what they had came for, the man yelled out, "Open the rest of them." Sam tried, but the top drawer was locked, and he could only manage to open the bottom drawer halfway because his grandpa's lifeless body was collapsed in front of it. Just then, the man holding the gun on Sam saw some shiny coins among the contents on the floor. He walked towards them and bent over to pick it up. Sam knew that they were going to kill him, so he summoned the courage to run. Straight for the front door he went. The gunman wheeled around and fired 2 more shots into the thick log walls. All hell had broken loose. Sam ran into the foggy night towards his brother's house for help. Meanwhile, Lucinda and Raina had been running frantically into the night. First, they hid underneath the mill, but hearing all the gunshots made them think the killers were searching for them. Lucinda said to Raina, "We gotta get across that creek to the other side." "But I can't swim. The water's too high. I can't do it." "Raina, you gotta do it or they're gonna kill us. Hold my hand. I'll help you get across." Desperately, they stepped into the near freezing water of the creek. Raina didn't even have shoes on. "Come on, Raina. We gotta go now," Lucinda shouted as she pulled Raina into the swift water, but the bottom was covered with mud and slippery rocks, and the young granddaughter wasn't strong enough to even stand in the strong current. In that moment, Raina fell into the water, with Lucinda clenching her tiny hand with all the strength she had. But the whole time, Raina could barely keep her head afloat and was swallowing so much water that she could barely take a breath. Lucinda pulled with all her might, trying to get Raina back to the shore. But just then, Lucinda slipped in the mud, and as she fell, she lost hold of Raina's hand. Suddenly, both of them were separated in the dark, frigid water, fighting for their lives. For the next few minutes, Lucinda fought for her life, caught in the current, gasping for air each time her head surfaced, clawing at any branch she could reach. All the while, her body was smashing into boulders in the swollen torrent as the rain poured from the heavens non-stop. In one frantic act of desperation, she reached for a limb that was hanging above, and somehow she held on, and after fighting her way inch by inch, she reached the banks, completely spent and exhausted. Yet her heart was tore out. Young Raina was nowhere to be found. Somehow, Lucinda had survived, but she was suffering from hypothermia as she ran into the dark woods, hoping desperately to find shelter. When she finally saw an opening, she ran into a field, exhausted as she trudged through the mud and the rain. She could barely see because of the fog, and delusion was beginning to set in from the trauma of it all. She came to a deep gully, and then she realized she must be close to her brother John's house. She followed the side of the gully for some time before she slipped and fell down the side, tumbling until she blacked out. By now, Sam had reached his Uncle John's house, and he told him of all the horrors that had unfolded inside the cabin. Without any hesitation, the men grabbed every gun in the house and set out on horses. They stopped at 2 neighbors' houses on the way, and several more men joined their armed posse. There was no time to seek out the law at this time of night or in these weather conditions. No, sir. It was time for mountain justice as the men raced towards Henry Snodderly's cabin. Nearly a mile away, with her dress nearly torn off of her, young Raina had somehow managed to survive the creek and had walked to John's house. She was in complete shock. However, everyone in the house was now gone, and the door was locked. She had no choice. She had to get out of the rain. And in her mind, the killers were still after her. So she busted out the window with a rock, and she made her way into the house, where she hid in a closet for the rest of the night. About midnight, the posse had finally reached the cabin, armed to the teeth. Yet, there was no sign of the killers. They had stolen 2 horses and disappeared into the night. Inside the cabin, it was a horrific scene. The men had went through every drawer looking for money. Yet, in the end, they had committed these brutal murders and hadn't found a single penny of money in the house. The only question that remained was, who were these men and where did they go? By daybreak, the sheriff had arrived on the scene. Most of the posse hadn't stuck around to wait on the law, and they had been hot on the trail, following the horse tracks leading away from the crime scene. Lucinda had regained consciousness and finally made it to John's house at daybreak, where she saw the broken window and found young Raina, shaken and unable to speak, still hiding in the closet. The sheriff, being the noble lawman that he was, immediately began his investigation of the crime scene. After interviewing Lucinda and Sam, some details didn't quite add up in this sheriff's mind. 2 people were murdered. There was no evidence of a forced entry, and supposedly the men had committed these awful crimes. Yet they didn't steal any money. After all, there was still $116 in that dresser in the drawer that just happened to be locked, and it just so happened that Lucinda was the only one who had a key to it. No, this didn't look right in the sheriff's mind at all. Perhaps the whole thing was simply made up, and with that in his mind, shockingly, he arrested Sam for the murder of Henry and Serena Snodderly. So, while the law was focusing solely on Sam, the real murderers had time to completely disappear before Sam and Lucinda were able to convince them that they recognized who the man was with the unmistakable scar running across his face. And that man was John Stanley, who had been living in the Carnes community, and Stanley was known to run with another man named Clarence Cox, who was from a place called Scarborough, known nowadays as Oak Ridge. And as word spread all over East Tennessee about the murder, newspapers spread the story, and witnesses who knew Stanley and Cox began to come forward and tell a tale of how one night they were drinking and playing poker, and they heard the 2 men bragging that they knew an old man who kept a bag of silver coins hid in his cabin, that he was so heavy it couldn't be lifted by a single man, and they were going to pay him a little visit. And it was true that the old man was a wealthy man, and now that he was dead, his family wanted the killers caught, so they offered a $200 reward for their arrest, and the state of Tennessee offered another $300. And let me tell you, $500 was a fortune in 1894. Within days, every bounty hunter, detective, and mountain man were combing the hills of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky looking for the 2 killers. The sounds of hounds and horses echoed all across the mountains. Before long, an anonymous tip tracked the fugitives to where they were spotted in Kentucky, so they fled to Virginia. But because of the scar on John Stanley's face, he couldn't disguise himself or blend in, no matter where he ran. Bounty hunters and mountain men alike began to close in on the wanted men, and they knew their time was running out. So in a twist of events, they stole a boat in Virginia and floated back down the Powell River, all the way back to Tennessee, about 5 miles from Clinton. There, they concocted a plan to have Clarence's father turn him into the law so he could collect the reward money to hire lawyers in their defense. Just like that, they turned themselves in. But, you see, the wheels of justice moved much swifter back in those days. And within just 4 months of the original brutal crimes, both men stood trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder. And the prosecution, they wanted an eye for an eye, and that meant the death penalty. The trial captivated the nation as the potential for the first legal hanging in Union County, Tennessee drew near. The courthouse was standing room only during the trial, It quickly became apparent that these killers had made many mistakes during their initial getaway. After killing the Snodderlys, the men stopped several times the next day, asking for food and directions. There were nearly a dozen witnesses that placed them in the area of the crime. And seeing how the prosecutor in this case was none other than John Snodderly, son of Henry Snodderly, you could be assured that he left no stone unturned in building a case against the defendants. And by the time the prosecution rested its case, there was nary a doubt in any person's mind that Clarence Cox and John Stanley were both guilty of murder, and the jury agreed too, finding both men guilty on all counts. When the judge asked Stanley and Cox if they had anything to say before he passed their sentence, they maintained that they hadn't had a fair trial and that they wanted to appeal. When they were finally done speaking, Judge Hicks began. "I'd rather that this cup would pass from me, but I tell you, the sheriff will fix an enclosure within 1 mile of the jail in Maynardville, Tennessee, at a place that suits himself, and on the 24th day of August, 1894, he will hang both of you by your necks until you are dead." True to their words, both men did appeal their cases to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which only temporarily delayed the case, because again, justice was swift, and their convictions were upheld. So it was 10 months after committing one of the most brutal crimes ever documented in East Tennessee, Stanley and Cox awaited their day of reckoning on December 22nd, 1894, in their jail cells. This was to be the first legal hanging in the history of Union County, and nearly 5,000 folks came in from everywhere to witness it. By sunrise, every picket, hitching post, and swinging limb in Maynardville was called into use for hitching horses. Yards and fields were turned into parking lots of horses and mules. By noon, the jailhouse yard surrounding Hangman's Hill had turned into a sardine mass of humanity. Inside the jail, the sheriff's wife had cooked the last meal for the convicted men who had spent the day with preachers. Finally, the time had come, and the sheriff gave the order. The two men were hogtied and placed on the back of a mule-drawn wagon, surrounded by armed guards. Imagine for a moment what went through the men's minds as they were placed on the wagon, and they looked down and realized that each of them were sitting on their own coffin. As they looked up and saw the gallows just up on the hill, hundreds of men jostled with one another for a glimpse of the dead man. Many men ran through the creek, which ran beside the road, for a better look. Yet, during this carnival-like atmosphere and spectacle, there was one hitch. You see, Tennessee law stipulated that the hanging couldn't be performed in public, and that only a few witnesses were permitted to be present. So the sheriff had constructed a 15-foot-high fence around the gallows, so that the thousands who had traveled to the little community of Maynardville couldn't see the actual hanging. No sooner than the armed convoy entered the fence and closed the gate to the public, men who had been drinking all day began ripping the wooden planks off the fence, before hundreds of men began storming the fence, finally knocking the entire structure to the ground in a stampede. The sheriff realized he was outnumbered, and he couldn't do anything to stop the entire crowd from getting a front row seat. The two killers took their places on the platform, and while Cox stood there shaking, Stanley spoke to the crowd. "Men and boys alike, hear my words to you now. Drinking whiskey and carrying a gun is what brought me here. Now, I hope none of you have to go the way I'm about to go." And with that, he took a small plug of tobacco and began to chew it. He held up the rest of the plug and he asked, "Is there any man here that wants the rest of this? I got no more use for it." Just then, an old mountaineer made his way through the crowd running. "I'll take it! I'll take it!" He gladly took the gift, put it in his pocket, and thanked the condemned man. As Stanley enjoyed one last chew, he said, "Sheriff, I've got one more last request. Can we sing in the sweet by and by?" "Of course we can," the sheriff replied. Slowly, several men in the crowd began singing. Then, a sea of 5,000 men sang in sweet harmony as Cox and Stanley took in the scene. Just then, the sheriff gave the order, and both men fell to their deaths at the exact same time. The crowd kept right on singing as their bodies gently swayed in the breeze, thus concluding the first and last legal hanging to ever occur in Union County, Tennessee.